Good morning. I thought it would be helpful to start off by explaining who I am, but Bill's done that. So the next thing is, why am I here? And the reason I'm here is that in 2009, I went for a walk down the River Thames with my old friend, Professor Stephen Evans, who at the time was Professor of Sustainable Manufacturing at Cranfield and has since moved over to Cambridge. And we were talking at the time about climate change and the challenges of making research effective and creating some sort of impact as a result of that. And Steve asked me a question. He said, so what would be a reasonable way of measuring the degree of change that we could expect? And this was my answer. Really that removing carbon-based power stations was probably the easiest way of measuring the overall impact. So I like to have a bit of an explosion. I started my career in the army and used to blow things up for a living. So this is the sort of thing I quite like to see, and it's often not what you get to see at the beginning of a presentation. So after that conversation, I agreed that I would start spending some of my time pro bono working with Steve in order to make him more effective, because what I was doing, which was marketing and sales consultancy, wasn't really going to make a big difference. And after about 18 months of working like that, we had the chance to bid for £6 or £7 million worth of money from the EPSRC to try and set up this centre. And I foolishly said that if we succeeded, I would give up my well-paid work and go and join a university. But the reason I do this is because I want to see impact. I want to see things actually change. So that's what my motivation is. Now, part of what I was asked to talk about was innovation policy. And I will talk a bit about it, but I do know that I only really understand a bit about innovation policy in the UK, and the audience that's here today probably is very non-UK focused, as well as possibly not being hugely interested in policy. So if I briefly talk a little bit about innovation policy, started to appear in about 1979 in the Department of Trade and Industry. It was identified that probably government should be doing something to try and encourage the British manufacturing and British industry to become more innovative to respond to its declining position in the world. In the end, I'm not actually convinced that policy does a great deal to forge innovation. Whilst it can be very helpful at supporting it, the actual drive and all of the things I've done in my time and all of the people and companies I've spoken to over the last 7 years would suggest to me that policy wasn't the fundamental reason why they started to innovate or change whatever it is they were doing. I think the most helpful thing that governments do in making innovation more effective or helping innovation is actually that last pair of binoculars called foresight down at the bottom corner. Because the ability of government to convene and fund really strong cross-industry and cross-country investigations into what's happening in the future, I think is one of the most useful and valuable parts of what I've seen come out. We were fortunate enough to participate in what I think is one of the most useful long-term studies that's been carried out, and this was a foresight investigation into the future of manufacturing to 2050. It spent 2 years, drew together a wide range of people from industry, from academics, from policymakers, and produced a very comprehensive view. it came up with a vast range of recommendations. Some of the ones I put up here I think are interesting, in part because they reflect some of the things I heard being said yesterday. So one of those areas, sustainable technology. I think what Bill Macbeth was presenting yesterday, for those that you were here, in terms of looking at low energy, low water treatment of fabrics to make a huge impact on the sustainable footprint of fabric finishing, is absolutely in that area, and one of very, very many things that will be hugely transformative. And this is a report that was looking out to 2050. The level of disruption, the level of diversification that's required for business to sustain and grow during that time means that you've got to be able to cope with and disrupt yourselves. And one of the conclusions from the report was that businesses that aren't able to understand and respond in a proactive way to the changes and disruptions that will happen will not survive. Those that can, those that are prepared, those that have worked out how to disrupt themselves, how to manage and cope with the disruption that will be brought on them, will be the ones who are most powerful and most able to ride those waves, continue to build their strength, and probably take huge market share from their competitors that aren't in that same place. If you really are interested in policy as well, this report on industrial evolution came out last year. I'm pleased to say it was sponsored by Barry and the Manufacturing Commission, and this looks at what sort of policy responses would be sensible for government to take. And this is predominantly UK focused, but I have to say that some of the policy recommendations I would say would be pretty applicable in most parts of Europe. And it came up with 24 really strong recommendations as to how governments could go beyond the financial and patent type support that they provide at the moment. So what to innovate? Well, should we be innovating on technology, which I guess is what many of you in this room are here doing and thinking about? Clearly, that's an essential part of any form of innovation strategy, any form of innovation program. Should we also be innovating our business models? Because I would say absolutely, because without having business models that are fit for purpose, along with technology that's changing, you don't get effective business transformation. And if you're going to do that, you also have to innovate value, because at the heart of making business models effective is the value transactions that they are built around. So I think you have to innovate all of those things, and you have to do them at the same time. Disruptive innovation, many of you may or may not be familiar with the disruptive innovation theory, but the idea that we've identified is, if you're going to be disruptive, what we've seen that works most effectively is that disruptors start in a place where nobody's looking. They start in a place where nobody's looking, but there is a group of customers or potential customers that really will value some of the things that their new disruptive technology or service is going to provide. So there are some pretty good tools already around. So the Oosterwolde and Pigneur business model canvas, I guess some of you are familiar with. Can I just get a show of hands? I'm always interested to know how many people have actually come across this. Okay, about half. This is a tool that was invented in 2007 by Oosterwolde and Pigneur. It's a very interesting way of trying to map out how a business model is going to work for you. We took this as our starting point at Cambridge when we started to look at how and what makes sense to do when you're innovating a business model. And we identified that there are a number of weaknesses, but most importantly, it doesn't really take into account the whole range of stakeholders that businesses have. And we find that that's really important in any business model innovation, but particularly if you're looking to be sustainable. It tends to focus on profit outcomes only and not the other sort of outcomes that can drive business effectiveness and value. And it doesn't really spend very much time on trying to understand the value that's being exchanged between different parties. So we said, okay, if we start here, what have we found that actually makes business model innovation more effective? So first of all, focusing on the value exchanges. So we've identified that there are a number of different types of value that get exchanged to varying degrees of effectiveness. So we've spotted 4 areas. There's value that's missed, there's value that's destroyed, 5 areas. There's value that's captured to start with. I always forget to talk about that one. The stuff you understand already. Then there's the stuff you don't understand, the things you're missing, the things that you're giving people they don't want, the things that are absent, the things that people would like you to provide them that you didn't identify or haven't spotted, and the things that are surplus, where you've got more capacity and capability than is actually required. We think that if you look at the whole stakeholder network, you get such a different view of how your business works and where opportunities lie. We look at the life cycle, so how does value change across the life cycle, and where, if you're a service business, where does value get exchanged when the service and the recipient of that service actually meet? Then we have other elements that look at when you're coming to deploy, what are the other things that will make a lot of sense? I'll come back to this in some more detail in a moment. So we've built a structured approach to value that starts with what you're capturing, identifies those 4 areas of what's being missed. So value destroyed in manufacturing is most easily thought of as value that's being provided in the environment. For instance, it might be pollution. It's value being provided to a stakeholder that stakeholder really didn't ask for or want you to give them. Surplus is where you've got more capacity than you require. That's a fairly straightforward thing to understand. And absence is where you haven't understood what your potential stakeholders want from you. The outcome of all of that is opportunity. We've built 4 tools that can really help to explore and understand what happens within value exchanges in order to make your business model much more effective. The first one is value mapping. This is what we think of as the conch. It's a model that allows you to put the various stakeholders. So you start with this model by thinking, who are the stakeholders I want to engage with? And you then make sure that all of those stakeholders are represented. And as you go through the steps of the process, you ask them to identify what value has been captured in the middle. Then you go through and slowly unwind the spiral, looking at the various elements that are missed or destroyed. Across the top of this tool, you've got beginning of life, middle of life, and end of life. And people will work out for their particular product or business what those look like, and then they map down looking at those same areas of value, missed, destroyed, absence, and surplus, but looking at how that occurs during different parts of the life of that particular product line or business. So this is an enormously powerful way of looking at a different perspective on the business. We then have a tool that looks similarly at service, looking at the touch points of service. And finally, we have a very comprehensive set of tools that look at what happens next. So you've identified some opportunities, you can make some changes, you can see where you'd like to add more value, change the business models that you've got at the moment. We then have a set of tools because what we identified is up to 80% of businesses that go through the process of identifying where and how they want to make fundamental business model change fail. And they don't do it for a series of reasons. And this tool unpacks those reasons and helps the organization step through who actually is going to be involved in making these changes happen? Forces you to think about different ways. Should you be providing your delivery as a service? Should it be a product? Should it be some hybridization of those things? And if so, how would that hybridization work? And then it steps through, looks at the risks that you're taking, and eventually builds a detailed plan that brings all of the people that are going to be needed to make this change work through the process of understanding the change and how and in what ways they would implement that. So I would recommend that these could be extremely helpful tools. I'd come back to why there was one more thing I did that was more fun than working in universities that's also very much about innovation. So back in 1983, this music video came out by Herbie Hancock. It was pretty innovative at the time. It was the first time anyone had put scratching onto a mainstream piece of music video, or music rather, and they commissioned Godley and Cream to put together this music video that went with it. And I was fortunate enough at the time to be working with Jim Whiting, who's the guy who invented these strange beasts. So that was slightly more fun than being at universities. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for this very kind introduction. And it's my great pleasure and honor to be here for the first time in Huddersfield. So I can finally see all these wonderful things that Bill is telling me about that are going on here. So what I'm going to tell you a bit about this morning is the future directions in the textile sector. Obviously, there are many, so I have to focus a bit, and my time is also restricted. So when thinking about the future directions, well, the best thing is to start from today. So what I want to start with is actually a snapshot of what the European EU28 textile and clothing industry looks like in figures. So it's actually a very nice picture, and I would like to specifically, and I highlighted that in green, to look at the employment figures. Because Eurotex just celebrated its 20th anniversary, but even before there were predecessor organizations based in Brussels following the sector. And as far as the people working there can remember, and some have been working there for a long time, we've never seen a plus on the employment side. So it's the first year in probably 30 or more years that we've seen a positive development. So we had heard stories about the reshoring, things coming back to Europe, and we always said, well, we can't see it in the figures. There may be anecdotal evidence here and there, but we can't really see it in the European figures. It's the first year that we can see it. And actually this country here is largely responsible for this. And all the other figures also look quite positive. I'm sure the investment part will also turn positive after ITMA in November last year, so probably that effect takes a little longer to go in. We also see the continuing trends of exports from the EU outside growing steadily, and imports in terms of value they have grown, in terms of volumes they have decreased, they've continued to decrease. The difference is actually the appreciation of the US dollar, because most of the imports are paid in dollars. So very, very positive trends. We hope it will stay like this in 2016, and obviously also we hope we can talk about the EU28 figures in 2016 again, and that's as far as commercials will go for me. We also say that always very clearly that we may not be the volume or the production leaders in the world in terms of textiles and clothing, but in terms of innovation, in terms of fashion creation, in terms of technical and technological solutions, we are clearly number one in the world. So what we're looking at is a number of innovation or research themes that we really see shaping the future of this industry. But what I really want to do in this talk is to let you or think along with you about a few major future trends. And there are three of them that I've singled out, and I will show then in the end that they all converge in a certain way. So we have digitization or virtualization as a very important, very powerful, inevitable trend that we see in our economies. We have sustainability and circularity, and we see also important developments on the consumer side. So the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, people are rather interested in paying per use. So all these three trends, I can't go into details of all of them. So I singled out the digitization because that's probably the one that is, while often talked about, still massively underestimated in terms of impact. So what I want to answer is this question: what does this digital circular sharing economy mean for the textile and clothing industry? So if you stay with the digital and the virtualization, I mean, we see these things playing out in many sectors, in many markets. So we are turning experiences from the real world that we experience through physical presence into a virtual representation that we experience through a digital device typically. And we know many examples of this. Why we do that? Because there are important, powerful advantages. It becomes replicable, it becomes storable, scalable, and it lowers the cost for the user. And as you see on the very right side, it also comes to the textile and fashion industry. So let us take a step back and think about what today's fashion business is about. And Jesse has done an excellent job already matching this value chain and how it has developed. So we have actually still an industry largely based on a 20th century business model where you focus on mass production and mass distribution. Whereas in the textile and fashion industry, that model was very much driven by the distribution side, much more so than in other manufacturing sectors where the manufacturing side actually calls the shot. I think in this industry it was more the distribution, the brands that did. So we have seen then a number of successful evolutions towards the top end of the market, so the premium and luxury fashion business has done very well over the years. But we've also seen on the other side, the lower side of the market, whether in the form of the fast fashions, the Zaras and H&Ms and Mangos of this world, or even to the very lowest market level, discount fashion, where it really the idea is not, it's the very opposite of a luxury. You pay little for a lot of volume. But all these things, all these business models are essentially the same, and they've hit a number of trouble spots. The first one is the cost of store and of stock. These stores that you have where you sell, they cost you a lot of money. And that is not a problem as long as everybody else sells through stores and has the same cost. But we know that is increasingly not the case anymore. And there are companies that are selling billions worth of fashion products. They don't even have stock, like in Alibaba. So there, the business model is changing. Then there's the enormous cost of the supply chain and the legal compliance that is increasing every year. And all the key players in the market know that the digital, the online is for real, so they have to invest in this. They have to have a strategy for this. But that brings uncertainty and it brings cost. So let us think about what it actually means, or perhaps first just to see if the impact of the online is real. Well, this is a list of the top 10 fastest growing fashion retailers in Europe. And you see that 6 out of the 10 are pure online players. They don't have a single store. And out of the 4 remaining, the number 2 you can forget because they have grown through acquisitions and they're now closing stores and are unprofitable. For the other 3, probably Primark is still doing pretty well, but for the others, I'm not so familiar with. But the onslaught of the online sellers is really there. So let us think about how that actually changes fundamentally the business model. So that's a picture of a traditional retail model, a traditional supply chain model, where you have basically distributors or brands that integrate backwards. They integrate their supply chains, they manage their supply chains, their suppliers, and then they try to offer something to customers, to capture customers, to invest in marketing and branding and stores and all, to make those customers, those consumers come to them and buy from them. when you go online and when you think about specific, and when you look at the digital world, things look different, especially those companies that really have a kind of a platform model. They're not integrating backwards, they're integrating forwards. They're integrating or they're aggregating consumers. They lock in consumers into their ecosystems. And they offer enormous choice, so consumers have no reason to step out of their ecosystems. So all those that you saw on the previous slides, they do that to a certain extent. And we still believe that these are retailers. But they're not just retailers. These companies are platforms that, on the one side, they aggregate consumers, and on the other side, they are providing services to suppliers, fulfillment services, warehousing services, whatever. So all the cost of the supply chain, they leave them out, and they really lock in consumers. And it's a very, very powerful model, especially as these models can actually grow and replicate very fast. So if you think about it, typically they start at the bottom of it. These online platforms, they invest heavily to generate traffic. So consumers, people, users going there. Of course, if you have a lot of traffic, a lot of sellers, a lot of suppliers want to sell on your platform, that increases the selection. If the selection is larger, customers find more, so the customer experience is growing. So that's a virtuous cycle, and then obviously as they're selling more through a relatively fixed cost structures, the cost element goes down, they can offer lower prices, the consumers are more happy, and the whole virtuous circle flywheel is actually growing. So, but the question is, how far will that trend go? How far will it replace what we believe is fashion shopping? And of course, we know that this is what we have sometimes in our heads. These are our dreams. But before you realize these dreams, there are other realities that are linked to cost, to inconvenience, and all the rest. So, and if you think that online retail, online shopping will look like it looks today, 10 years from now, you could be not more wrong. So we will see such an immersive experience, online shopping for fashion, and whether we're wearing things like these, I don't know, but this is the direction. So virtual reality, artificial intelligence will create shopping environments that will have nothing to do with today's online shops. So also, you have to think, well, shopping, real estate. Today's prime shopping real estate are these primary shopping malls or shopping temples that we find, especially in the bigger capital cities. They will probably still continue to do well for a while. But look at secondary cities already, what online retail does to the retail environment. So tomorrow's real shopping real estate, prime real estate, will be here. Will be on consumers' smartphone screens. And if you don't make it to the welcome screen, you may not sell to many consumers. So what we can expect, what we should expect, is that digitization in the distribution, but then also moving into manufacturing, because these platforms will not stop at the retail. They will explore manufacturing as well. And digital printing, for instance, is a prime example for this. Already on Amazon today, if you order a book published in the US, in Europe, you get it printed here in the UK or in Poland or in Germany. They manufacture that book for you. Could they do that for fashion? Probably in a few years. I believe that this cheap, mass-produced, fast fashion wave is probably hitting a peak somewhere relatively soon. And in this new world, these consumer platforms and the strong brands selling, or the smart brands selling on these platforms, they will do pretty well. But the store-based retails and many weaker brands will have a hard time, and they have to reinvent their business models. We also believe that personalization, customization, also this service linking products with services is something that will see a real breakthrough. We've been talking about for many years, but certain technologies were not ready yet. The consumers did like the idea, but they didn't find the offer, and the industry didn't have the tools to really make it happen. Now that will indeed happen. The sustainable, the ethical fashion trend, that is also for real. It will stay there. It will be a niche market, but a nice niche market, a relatively sizable one. And even sharing of certain fashion items may, from the consumer side, be still a bit far away, but from a producer or designer side, and TCBL is a good example of that, it's something very real. So when we started looking at these trends about a year ago, that's what was our conclusion for the digital impact on fashion. Not too much change near term, but a real disruption potential in 5 to 10 years. Well, in the meantime, thinking about it and observing what is happening, I would rather change that statement to disruption being just at our doorsteps. So, but I was saying at the beginning of my speech that these three trends, they're actually merging into something very, very powerful, and something that is not often thought about. Because all these three combine into something that you can describe as dematerialization. That small piece of glass, plastic, and metal replaces all this mass of material products that nobody will ever buy anymore. And what that also shows is that we generally see the demise of the single use or the single purpose device. Because all of these things that you see on the right side are single purpose devices that are merged into a multi-purpose device. And that will go on. Let us think about one of the most inefficient single-use devices. What could that be? I think you said it. It's a personal car. Now you may disagree in saying, well, there are different things that you can do in a car rather than going just from A to B or sitting in a traffic jam. But I think if given better option, most people would prefer not to do these other things in their cars. But even if you just think about the driving aspect, so the average car that you own is standing still 92% of the time that you own it. And then even if you drive, you typically drive alone, or 1.5 passenger on average, while you have 5 seats in it. And then even if you do the driving, you look at the energy conversion, that 86% of the fuel that you put in the car never reaches the wheels. And then even if you look at just this tiny little orange spot at the top of this drop, which is actually the energy that you use to move yourself, because that's what you want to do when you go by car. You want to move yourself, you don't want to move the car. So that is very inefficient, and it's a single-use device. And there is an enormous potential for digitization, for sharing, for resource efficiency in this. And while there is a lot of potential for innovation and growth in this, my belief is that in 10 or 20 years from now, we will produce and buy a lot less cars, because we will just push up this use percentage, this tiny use percentage of 8 to maybe just something like 20. And that would remove more than 50% of all cars that we have on our roads. And that will have an impact on a huge industry. What about textile materials? So will we see dematerialization, complete dematerialization of fashion anytime soon? Well, I guess that's probably a relatively low probability event, especially in the near future. But it doesn't mean that these trends will not affect our industry. So the digital circular sharing economy will likely lead to a slowing of material volume textile clothing consumption around the world, but especially in the aging industrial world. Just thinking about that, the average 80-year-old is just consuming less stuff than an average 20 or 30-year-old. And as our population weight shifts in this sense, we have a natural trend to less consumption. So our industry needs to learn to make more with less. extracting more profits out of less production. And that's easier said than done. So, but traditional volume producers and distributors, they will have to think about new business models and how to deal with this new environment. And I think it's helpful to understand those trends when you look at industries that are sort of digitally disrupted or dematerialized before the textile and fashion industry, like the paper industry or the music industry. In the past, we used to buy a physical good to listen to music. Now we don't do anymore, and many other sectors. So, and I want to finish here not with a statement, but rather with a question to TCBL. What can TCBL bring to this new world, especially for the smaller companies, the small designers, the small brands? Can it be a platform of sorts or a community that helps these companies that make up so much of our industry in Europe make that transition very successful? Thank you.